Collins, hate speech and hate crimes are on the rise in the United States. Internet and social media have allowed people who might not express the worst parts of their nature in a face-to-face setting to do so in relative anonymity. That and other societal factors have also emboldened people to feel free to say things that just a short time ago would have been unthinkable. And in Charlottesville, in Orlando, in Pittsburgh, and elsewhere, hate crimes have resulted in the loss of life. But we aren't immune to this here. Just last fall, 2 students had to leave Davidson College after it was learned that they shared hate speech on social media. At Queen's University of Charlotte, a swastika was drawn on a whiteboard, and other incidents have been reported at other colleges around North Carolina, including Appalachian State and Duke University. We live in a country where free speech is a cornerstone, but there have always been limitations to that speech, and in places like schools, where myriad ideas are discovered and explored, how do you police speech? Should you? Can you? We consider that this hour. We're joined by Rabbi Judy Schindler, director of the Stan Greenspon Center for Peace and Social Justice at Queen's University of Charlotte. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
She's in our Spirit Square studio along with Donna Tarney, education coordinator for that same organization, the Stan Greenspon Center for Peace and Social Justice at Queen's University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Laura Dunnigan is here. She is the co-editor-in-chief at Davidson College's student newspaper, The Davidsonian. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Nice to have you all here. Hate speech is occurring on multiple... I should mention before we start that you can join us via Facebook or Live. You can watch us on Facebook Live. You can also email us at charlottetalks@wfae.org. Get to us through Twitter at WFAE, while you can even find us on Facebook. Imagine that. Hate speech is occurring on multiple social media platforms and in society at large, as I just said, but we're going to concentrate on that kind of speech in an academic setting at schools. Just how pervasive is it? I'm not sure who to ask that question of. Let's start with Laura. You're the student. You're in the midst of it all. And you're at Davidson, which is an Ivy League kind of school, but how pervasive is it?
I would say in our daily interactions, it's not pervasive. Particularly at Davidson, we have a shared sense of honor and integrity that we choose to have by going to the school. And in our daily interactions, hate speech is not pervasive. But these kinds of incidents, the doxing that happened in November, that was preceded by...
Define doxing.
Okay, yes. So a doxing is where you share information intended to be kept private publicly, usually through the internet. So
why is it called? It's DOXXING. Why is it called that? Do you know?
I do not know.
Okay, fine.
But so the doxing that caused these 2 students to leave the school, that was an incident of hate speech, but even that was not isolated. A week before that, there was another incident where someone wrote Hitler did nothing wrong on an academic whiteboard, and there have been incidences of hate speech in previous years. So while it's not pervasive, it does exist.
So let's define it. And we're going to talk about the incident at Davidson at some length a little bit later on in the program, but let's define what hate speech is in your eyes, and does it change from school to school, person to person? I mean, for all the horrible characteristics that Hitler exhibited, is it hate speech to say Hitler wasn't wrong? And what makes it so?
Okay, so in preparation for this, I found a wonderful definition of hate speech on a law site online, and I agree with it completely. Hate speech is a communication that carries no meaning other than the expression of hatred for some group, especially in circumstances in which the communication is likely to provoke violence. It is an incitement to hatred primarily against a group of persons defined in terms of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, religion, sexual orientation, and the like. Hate speech can be any form of expression regarded as offensive to racial, ethnic, and religious groups and other discrete minorities or to women. And teaching in a high school, shout out B period, I actually find that my students are using this type of language against each other, not as a joke, but as a way to incite a reaction.
Where does that definition come from again?
This comes from law.com online.
Society at large is certainly, we seem to be experiencing a rise in anti-Semitism. In 2017, the Anti-Defamation League reported a 57% increase in anti-Semitic incidents over just the previous year. Is this the worst category, or are other minority groups experiencing similar incidents, rising incidents of hate speech and hate crimes? Judy.
I don't believe this is the worst category. I believe issues of race are targeted more than those related to religion. So I don't think we're the greatest victims, but we have seen an incredible increase in incidents of anti-Semitism, especially in the last 2 years.
We're seeing this now, and we'll talk about why we think we're seeing this uptick in hate speech and hate crime. But have these feelings always been there, just under the surface, being tamped down by societal norms, and now suddenly they've been allowed to be released and bubble up to the surface? Or is this something new that's developing in the psyche of people that suddenly decide they need to hate somebody?
Sadly, in terms of anti-Semitism, it's been existent for thousands of years. We have been victims of persecution as Jews for a long time. The Spanish Inquisition, the Holocaust, the Crusades. We have been here before. But where we are, we're in a place where we really care, I believe, as a society, about civil discourse and learning how to find common ground. I think it is exhausting for everyone, no matter what background they have. It is exhausting to go to sleep at night and see arguing heads on a screen, and we need to really get beyond that. I think journalists have a huge responsibility. News needs to sell, and rather than content, it's conflict that is really filling sound bites and headlines. And we're better than that, and we need to go deeper than that.
Donna, you have, and you kind of alluded to this a second ago when you talked about your personal experience with high school students using epithets to offend each other with deliberately. Yeah. You say you have personal experience related to school bullying and the rise in student confidence levels when speaking out using prejudicial and hateful language. They feel it's okay. They're confident in their being right to say what they're saying.
Yes.
Where's that coming from?
That, I believe, is coming from the example of adults in communities, in politics, in social media. When our students watch the sound bites that come across all the different places that they get their news, and they hear very important people expressing very prejudicial and hateful ideas, and then no one contextualizes that, and no one in the media immediately addresses why that was over the line, students realize that they can try their hand at that. And I have seen this in my own school. I have heard this anecdotally from the many, many, many teachers I know, not only in Charlotte, but throughout the United States. And a study by the UCLA Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access done in May of 2017 also noted that a growing number of schools, particularly predominantly white schools, became hostile environments for racial and religious minorities and other vulnerable groups in the first 6 months of 2017.
Who are the people making the statements that are leading to this kind of behavior? I mean, you said that these are prominent people. Who are they? No names.
In my experience, they are politicians.
Who?
I have heard our president express very hurtful comments about groups of people based on race, sexual orientation, and gender.
And I knew you were referring to him, so I thought I'd have you mention him so I could talk about what the other part of the thing that you said, which is that the media needs to step in and say that's over the line. It puts us in a really awkward position. And I think maybe the other side or people using the media know this. I mean, it's going to be hard to believe for some young people, but there was a time when the media was viewed as being unbiased, where we really didn't talk about issues that were controversial because of the equal time provision and the fairness doctrine, which have gone by the wayside. And those documents said that if you're going to talk about a controversial issue, you had to address both sides. Well, there's sometimes not both sides. Sometimes it's just wrong. But now that's gone by the wayside, so media has become more provocative. So what is our role? How do you see our role? How do we call out somebody who says something, who are we to say that that's over the line? I guess is my question. Who are we?
You can bring in another side. So when there is a controversial statement, you can teach the community how to engage in deeper dialogue in an issue by raising other issues and looking at the underlying sources and symptoms that lead to such hate. But
isn't that giving a false equivalency? I mean,
that can be dangerous, obviously creating a false equivalency. But if we only have one side and the soundbite that sparks a reaction, such a passionate reaction, we are creating a polarization that doesn't encourage people to find that common ground and go deeper into the issue. Mm-hmm. I think it's really important to mention right now that there is a program on March 14th and 15th aimed at journalists. Amanda Ripley is an academic, I believe. She's asked herself the same question that you're asking right now. She's a nationally noted journalist and author. And she said, can we stop talking past one another and start making conversations about our differences useful again? So she's having a whole conference on this issue for journalists, but for the broader community on March 14th and 15th.
I know, Laura, you probably aren't planning to go into a journalism career, but you are acting as a journalist now at your college newspaper, the Davidsonian. You're the co-editor-in-chief. What's your take on that?
The way I think about it, when we write the news, we try to write things such that they don't elicit much of an emotional response. Or if they do, we can contextualize that so that people, when they read the news, understand that these are just the facts and any reaction they may have is not coming from our journalism. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a way to keep us accountable, to make sure that we are delivering news that is unbiased, but also making sure that the information we get is not tampered and doesn't lead into that, whatever it is now that is creating such an emotional response to the news.
And do most students get their news about Davidson? Well, of course, they would get most of their news about Davidson from your newspaper, but where do students get their news these days? Is it from television? Is it from NPR? Is it from apps on the phone? Where do they get it?
Not television so much. I would say internet, so CNN, NPR are the ones that I hear about a lot, but a lot of that also comes filtered through social media, so they'll be able to see what people in their networks are sharing on Facebook or sharing on Twitter, what people might be talking about, even places like Instagram where they'll take a screenshot of a news story and then share it there. So the way they access news, it's not so much that they go to the news sites, but they're aware of what other people are talking about, and then they engage with it.
You know, a picture's worth 1,000 words, but 1,000 words can do a heck of a lot more to explain what's going on than a picture. So in this world where we have Instagram, and people are using Instagram to get their news, is there a way to combat that? This is particularly a problem for young people who don't yet have the context that perhaps older people have because they've been around longer. What are you hearing from high school students, Donna?
I am hearing from high school students kind of the same thing about the college students. They're not watching television. They're not listening
Why not?
Because it takes too much time. They like the Instagram. They like the Snapchat. They are really sad that Vines went away because it was 15 seconds, I don't know the exact time, of something entertaining that then went to something more entertaining. So the tough challenge for schools is to build the time into curriculum to educate students about what they're hearing.
Donna Tarney is a high school teacher, but she's also the educational coordinator for the Stan Greenspon Center for Peace and Social Justice at Queen's University of Charlotte. She's here with Rabbi Judy Schindler and Laura Dunnigan. We're coming right back. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and NC IDEA, offering early-stage companies funding that can be used to grow and scale. Now accepting grant applications online at ncidea.org/info. And Blumenthal Performing Arts presenting Black Violin, a live two-man performance of classical hip-hop and rock, accompanied by their band and turntable DJ. March 5th, Belk Theater. Tickets at blumenthalarts.org. On the next Charlotte Talks, should Mecklenburg County levy a 1/4-cent sales tax to support the arts? That's being debated as Charlotte's longtime arts collective, the Arts and Science Council, faces what it calls a crisis point. We'll hear from them about why funding has fallen so low and then examine the international roots of America's opioid crisis in a conversation with the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State playing the lead role in combating this scourge. That's all tomorrow on this program beginning at 9.
Pete Buttigieg was just 29 when he was elected mayor of South Bend, Indiana. Now he's after the presidency. He's a veteran of the war in Afghanistan, an out gay man, and he says this country needs a fresh start. I'm Joshua Johnson, Mayor and Democratic presidential hopeful Pete Buttigieg. Next time on 1A from WAMU and NPR.
1A coming up at 10 right after Charlotte Talks on 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about hate speech and hate crimes, particularly in the context of an academic setting with Rabbi Judy Schindler. She's the director of the Stan Greenspon Center for Peace and Social Justice at Queen's University of Charlotte. Donna Tarney is with us. She's the education coordinator there. Laura Dunnigan is co-editor-in-chief at the Davidsonian, the newspaper for Davidson College. We live in a country that cherishes free speech. It is a cornerstone of our nation, and yet we live in a time where speech and actions that wouldn't have caused a second thought or a glance just a few short years ago are considered microaggressions. This is something new for a lot of people. Words or actions that make people feel unsafe. Comedians have canceled tours of college campuses because they've been heckled down. Speakers at graduation ceremonies on the left and right have been shouted down and have canceled their appearances at college campuses because the speech that they're making makes people feel unsafe. How much of what we're talking about with regard to hate speech could fall into that category? It's hate speech because it makes me feel unsafe.
That's not what we're talking about here on this panel. We're reacting to statements of hate that are potentially incite actions that could harm others. So we're not talking about those slights. I think an academic institution, we're creating a safe place in a classroom for our students to grow and explore issues and learn how to frame issues in a way that might not be hurtful to others. We teach about privilege and power and the way privilege is invisible to those who have it, right? So you might say something that could be deeply hurtful to someone else without recognizing that, whether it's regard to religion or race or economic issues. And so we're trying to create that space and teach the skills of discourse that enable people to have challenging conversations. So we're really encouraging our students to grow and learn and see things through different eyes and frame their language in a way that creates openings rather than closing doors.
Off the air, Donna, you said that one of the problems that we face today is that young people don't have time. It's a waste of time in their minds to watch television news or listen to a radio newscast because it takes too much time. They'd rather surf the internet quickly or look at Instagram quickly and get the headlines. And what that means is that they gravitate toward the most sensationalized things that are coming down the pike at any given moment in time. And they don't necessarily have the context for them to understand why it's sensational or why they should or should not believe it or what it means. They're not alone in that. It's not just young people. It goes all the way up to the dying breath of some people.
Completely agree.
So what are you doing in an academic setting that will stick over time with people to help them contextualize the ongoing onslaught of news?
So personally, in my classes, one of the best things that I have done is last semester in my Holocaust and Social Justice class, I picked up on the ADL. They had a Day Against Hate, and it was in October. And so for my classes, I asked my students to invite someone from our school who was completely different than them in one important way: race, gender, sexual orientation, and we had what was called an intentional challenging conversation. And we started with a list of questions, and we asked each other, when is the first time you remember experiencing prejudice? What was the event? How did it leave you feeling? And what we did was we invited the students, we got permission from administration, we had a conversation in our class that intentionally brought up some of these topics that we just breezed by as flashpoints, yelling at each other on our way to somewhere else. So we stopped and we intentionally built in time for conversation, and then we kind of unpacked what our individual conversations had been. And throughout the nation, I've found that in schools where this is done, the students learn how to engage with each other more respectfully, and the hostile environment actually decreases. My favorite is Arundel High School in Gainbrils, Maryland. They have an entire freshman class called a community citizenship class. It has 4 components. They talk about self, they talk about community, they talk about culture and race, and they talk about citizenship. And every freshman is required to take this class. So they have the space in which to unpack all of these sound bites that happen throughout the day. And they get an adult to help them navigate the complexities of having intelligent and civil discourse.
Hate speech, people may find this surprising, but hate speech is actually legal under the First Amendment unless someone is targeted by that hate speech. And since we cherish free speech in the country, how do you censor hate speech? Is it censorship, or is it a conversation that educates people in an academic setting? Judy, I'm going to throw it at you.
You know, Donna talked about inviting students to connect with someone across a line of difference. And I think relationship building is really a first step to being able to have hard conversations. Without that relationship, that's hard. But I think when someone says something that doesn't feel right, stopping to ask questions is a great step. So in my class that is called The Bible, Who's In, Who's Out, we deal with diversity and identity in the Bible. My students are taught the minute someone says the Bible says this, they stop and they ask them, well, what Bible are you reading, and what translation, and where is that, and who do you rely on to interpret that text for you? So sometimes just stopping to ask a question brings clarity, and going deeper and deeper. Like, what was that you said, and can we talk about that, and what do you mean by that? So questions are a great response.
So what do you see as the genesis of most hate speech? Is it ignorance? Is it lack of exposure to, or empathy, lack of empathy for others? What is the leading cause? And if because you don't know the cause, you can't correct it. You can't stop it.
I would say ignorance feeds into a lot of it. Not being exposed to all of the sides, as we were talking about earlier. It can become easy to only know what you are immediately exposed to and then build stereotypes, and without anything to challenge those stereotypes, anything to challenge that prejudice, that can feed into hate speech and incorrect assumptions on all levels about people that you're interacting with.
UCLA's Institute for Democracy, Education, and Access conducted a survey in May of 2017 of 1,535 teachers in public high schools across the country, and it found that a growing number of schools, particularly predominantly white schools, became hostile environments for racial and religious minorities and other vulnerable groups, and that polarization, incivility, and reliance on unsubstantiated sources have risen, particularly in predominantly white schools. What's driving that? Do we understand what's driving that?
I still go back to the fact that publicly this type of speech is condoned at the highest level. And our students, believe it or not, pay attention to what adults do. And they take their cues from what the adults in society around them are doing. And again, when I look at the success stories of my colleagues and even researching online, in the places where the adults step up and take a lead and proactively prepare their students to be civil discoursers, that the incidence of this type of speech drops because they know how to address the fear that comes with coming close to the other. Usually I talk to my classes about this in my Holocaust class. Why did this stuff happen? Why do genocides happen? Well, they're the penultimate result of fear and uncertainty and feeling threatened. And my kids came up with that in the class last semester on their own. They know where these unsettled feelings come from. They just have a hard time navigating what to do when they feel threatened or afraid.
Go ahead, Judy.
You know, Laura said she chose Davidson because she wanted a small liberal arts college that had an honor code. And what an honor code does, it says we don't tolerate hate on our campus. We don't tolerate disrespect of another human being. That's not the climate we create. So I think when there is an incident, God forbid, on a campus, when an administration says this is not acceptable on our campus, and Davidson acted swiftly, and those students did not return to the campus.
Let's talk about what happened at Davidson, because a lot of people don't know what happened at Davidson College. And this is back, when was this? Last fall?
November.
Mm-hmm. Davidson College had an incident following the shooting at the Pittsburgh Synagogue in October, which included a message on a whiteboard that read, as you said, that read, "Hitler did nothing wrong." Campus police evidently became pretty involved in trying to figure out who wrote that, and there were other incidents. What else happened out on the campus?
So in November, if I'm remembering correctly, it was just that. There was the Pittsburgh shooting. The Jewish student group Hillel had a vigil to remember the victims of that Pittsburgh shooting. Right around that time, there was the whiteboard that said Hitler did nothing wrong. And
there were some tweets, weren't there?
Well, that came with the doxing, yes.
Okay.
So when the doxing happened, which is where you publicly share information intended to be kept private, there were 2 Twitter accounts that were identified as belonging to 2 Davidson students that were full of what I would consider hate speech. They were threats of violence against lots of different marginalized identity groups. There were pictures of the KKK, and one Twitter account even admitted to having attended the Charlottesville rally. So there was a doxing by the Carolinas Worker Collective. These accounts became publicly known, and Davidson responded.
And at least 2 of your students were involved in those groups?
Right. So 2 students owned those specific accounts. It's not known at this time whether or not those accounts and those students had anything to do with what was written on the whiteboard, and it may never be known. But yes, there were 2 students that were involved in owning those Twitter accounts that had that hate speech on it.
So the Davidson Code of Honor that we've alluded to here, that prohibits racist or hate speech? Or is it just you won't cheat? What's in the Code of Honor?
So there are several parts of the honor code. There is the honor code that pertains to academics and student life, so that's what you think of typically: not cheating, not lying, stealing, plagiarizing.
Right.
We also have a code of responsibility, which pertains more to the social and interpersonal ways that you interact with students on a college campus. So because we don't just go to school there, we live there. And that has to do more with the standards and the values that we will hold each other to and that we agree to when we come to the school.
And so when 2 students find themselves embroiled in this kind of activity, is it because they have misunderstood the Code of Honor, they've ignored the Code of Honor, they signed the Code of Honor under false pretenses because they didn't believe it in the first place, they just wanted to go to Davidson College because Mommy and Daddy wanted them to go there? What's the deal?
It's hard to say. I choose to think it is a blatant violation of the honor code. There was one tweet on the account where someone had retweeted. The original tweet said, "What would happen if this account were found?" And they retweeted it and said, "I would be expelled from my school." They knew what was going to happen if those accounts were found. They knew they were violating the honor code and the standards that the community had. They chose to do it anyway. And
they were
not
expelled.
on campus anymore.
They were expelled, right?
I cannot confirm that. They no longer attend Davidson, but because of FERPA and different privacy policies, the school cannot release what actually happened.
Yeah, these are federal laws that protect the privacy of students. And so the school and students and parents and alumni, et cetera, would like the school to be more forthcoming, but legally they cannot.
Right.
Okay. How prevalent, because you're not just the co-editor of a newspaper, you're a student, and you've been there for a while. How prevalent is this kind of conversation, these thoughts, these associations among students?
Regarding hate speech?
Mm-hmm. Or just these thoughts about others who are not like themselves. How prevalent is it? How influenced is it, if it's prevalent, how influenced is it by leaders?
I would say it is not prevalent because the school culture is such that when those conversations begin around hate or othering other groups, campus culture is quick to shut them down. But what that can also do, like these two students, they were existing privately. They existed on the internet, and it was just between these two students that knew about them.
And these associations that these two students had were with neo-Nazi groups, correct?
We believe so.
What is the attraction? I'll ask all three of you. What is the attraction of a young person to a neo-Nazi group? What is it?
I've heard through other stories, I can't confirm about these two students in particular, but that there is a sense of community there. And of course, it's not how we would think of community, but there is something about joining a group that maybe has these other ideas that from the rest of the world are shut down. We do not accept neo-Nazism, but when you have that and you find other people that might agree, there's a sense of community there that is enticing.
And usually people who are attracted to those kinds of organizations are disaffected. Something has happened in their life where they don't feel 100% welcomed or part of the whole. So they find a group that's marginalized to which they can become a major part. You don't think of those people as being students at Davidson College.
Right. And that was one of the jarring things for me, particularly when these doxings became public. Something that I'm still thinking about is if these students were radicalized, if that's what you want to say, while they were at Davidson, was the liberal arts education that we're getting not strong enough to counter that? We talk a lot at Davidson about instilling humane instincts in our students, and that happens in the classroom all the time, but was that not strong enough to counter whatever else they were receiving through the internet?
When you say liberal arts, it's a small L liberal.
Yes.
It's not the big L liberal, but
Right.
a lot of people on the right would say it is.
Sure. I don't think so. I think the point of liberal arts is to become well-versed in several different ways of thinking. And we don't go to Davidson to learn a specific trade. We learn how to interact with each other and how to problem solve and how to critique things that we receive every day, which is something when the doxing happened, when the neo-Nazis were outed, that just didn't make sense how they could be neo-Nazis while also attending Davidson and practicing these skills of liberal arts.
Some wish that Davidson had acted more quickly. Some wish they'd done things differently. Students may have what do students think should have been done in light of what happened out there?
We feel that there should have been much clearer emergency communications as the events were happening. So the doxing started at about 8 p.m. Davidson responded on Twitter at 9 or 9:30, but there was not an official email sent from the college until nearly 14 hours after the doxing happened. So between that time period, all the communication that was happening was just between students, and it was little pieces of maybe I saw them on this part of campus police were leaving this building, and trying to piece together information that just wasn't correct.
Did people feel unsafe to be there?
Yes.
Because of what had been posted on these websites? Were there
Right.
threats of violence?
Yes, there were threats of violence, and on both of the students' named social media accounts, so the ones that we were aware of before, there had been pictures of them with weapons.
But, and I have 10 seconds here, but it seems to me that expecting a college to react in real time, where they're also trying to do due diligence, is impossible.
Right,
Isn't it?
it is.
Okay. We have to take a break. We'll come back and talk about more about hate speech and what to do about it in academic settings and elsewhere. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and the Charlotte Symphony, presenting a night of musical storytelling featuring Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty and Copland's Billy the Kid, February 22nd and 23rd at Night Theater. Info at charlottesymphony.org. And Charlotte Douglas International Airport, offering business valet parking to weekend getaway travelers during the spring season and year-round. More at cltairport.com/businessvalet. Coming up in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock, it's 1A. Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana, may be one of the best-known mayors in the country, and he's formed an exploratory committee for a presidential bid, making him the first millennial and the first openly gay candidate for president. They'll speak to him about his priorities in the 2020 race coming up in 20 minutes with Joshua Johnson on 1A. And we will continue our conversation about hate speech in America, particularly on school campuses, in just a few seconds. Stay with us.
WFAE received more than 370 podcast ideas during our Queen City PodQuest. Which ones will make it to the final round for the chance to win a cash prize and a podcast deal at WFAE? You decide. Vote for your favorite podcast idea once per day until our newly extended deadline of Wednesday, February 20th. Learn more on WFAE.org/Queen City Podcast.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about hate speech, particularly in the context of school campuses, with Rabbi Judy Schindler, director of the Stan Greenspon Center for Peace and Social Justice at Queen's University of Charlotte. Donna Tarney is with us. She's the education coordinator there and a high school teacher. And Laura Dunnigan is co-editor-in-chief of the Davidsonian. Before I talk about what students are doing in response to what happened at Davidson, something similar happened at Queen's University of Charlotte, also involving a whiteboard on which a swastika was posted. Swastikas also appeared on doors. I think there was one drawn on a small slip of paper and passed under an RA's doorway at Queen's. How does what went on there compared to what went on at Davidson?
Well, I'm not aware of any swastika on a whiteboard. It was a swastika on a piece of paper that was slipped under a door. It was far less public than what has happened at other institutions across our state and across our country. But any incident, even if it's on a piece of paper or a comment, it can highlight someone's sense of insecurity, especially after Pittsburgh, where we're feeling incredibly vulnerable. That was the worst attack on a Jewish community in the history of our being in the United States as a community since 1654. And so we're hypersensitive. We see these images of violence in our community. And so I don't think we can, we don't want to compare and we don't want to name and shame any school, but the incident at Queens was not on a whiteboard, it was on a piece of paper. But the student response was so powerful. I think the students are devastated. We haven't had an anti-Semitic incident that rose to that level in 15 years, the president said. But the students responded immediately. So a swift response of the administration is critical. Of course, they need the data to be able to respond. But the students live there, they're feeling unsafe, and they need some sort of response. Beyond that, though, the student response is critical. And I think our students were very frustrated because they worked so hard to create those strong multicultural bonds and work on interfaith dialogue and all these skills. And one act can result in people feeling unsafe.
But that one act can also result in a rallying of the forces. Has that happened at Davidson and or at Queens?
Absolutely. At Davidson it has. So immediately following the doxing on Friday of that week, there was a large demonstration that was hosted by several of our different student groups, including the Black Student Coalition, the Muslim Student Association, the Organization of Latin American Students, and Hillel, our Jewish student group. Mm-hmm. That was in our student union. It was broadcast across all forms of social media, where students came together to demand improved representation in the school. They wanted to come together to grieve and to show solidarity for each other. And they wanted to show the administration that students wanted changes. They want real changes within the administration and within campus policy to better be able to address these issues when they come up again.
What kinds of changes?
So improved emergency communications, as we were talking about. But there are also petitions now for a Jewish studies program to better educate the students and the student body broadly about issues of anti-Semitism and how that can be so broad. There's petitions for improved transparency that was started by alumni at the time of the doxing. So improved transparency and accountability from the administration in talking with the students. And there's also a project by the Black Student Coalition called Project 87 that is designed in part to increase representation of minority and marginalized students on campus.
I mentioned that these incidents also occur at places like Duke University. When you think of Duke, when you think of Davidson, and to a great extent when you think of Queens, you think of relatively privileged individuals going to these schools, and you think of more highly intellectual people going to these schools. If this is happening there, what is happening at public colleges and universities around the nation, where perhaps you have more of? Is it less so because those people are already more diverse, or do we know?
We're seeing it at college campuses across our country. Certainly, there was an incident at App State, too, in the fall, which I think you received information about. So I think it is widespread in high schools and middle schools and colleges and, in our society at large. And so we need to be not just reactive, we need to be proactive. And I think the petition to have Jewish studies at Davidson is a great one. We have a Jewish studies department at Queen's University. Some other things that the students are doing, they're working really hard to be an ally and think about what that means to be an ally. So our Muslim Student Association, they have 60 students. We now have an imam who works with us. So we have an imam, a rabbi, and a reverend on staff, on chapel staff. Some work part-time, some work full-time in that capacity. And when the imam came, he learned that there were 60 members of the Muslim Student Association, but he came to learn 30 are Muslims. So 30 join in order to be an ally. Right. And last weekend, all three of us as clergy went out to a Ripple conference at Elon where there were students. We had 13 students from Queens, and they create classes for each other and workshops, responding to hate, creating safe spaces, creating brave spaces where we can have those challenging conversations, having identity spaces where people can connect with those within their identity group, and community spaces where they can celebrate and teach each other. So we're teaching our students. And when I sat with the students on Saturday afternoon and I asked them what they each learned from this experience, one student went to a session on being an ally, and she said, I'm asking myself, how can I be an ally and how can I be a better ally?
Yeah. But you're preaching to the choir there. You're talking to people who want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. So when you have a situation as you had in Davidson, and the two students are no longer there, you don't know whether they were expelled or whether they just left on their own, because that's private information. But it seems to me that you are shoving those people who into the dark corner that they emerged from for a nanosecond and were discovered. You teach a diversity class at the Charlotte Catholic, Donna, and a lot of people on the alt-right side say diversity is the problem. So you have that, and then you have pushing people who don't agree with diversity off into this dark corner onto their own so they can stew in their own juices. How do you solve this problem?
So it has already been done. It's been done in little pockets throughout the United States. And I'm going to go back to the UCLA study. It says that while some school leaders avoid issues related to this political environment and the kind of conversations that are becoming more common, the polarization, and they worked proactively to create tolerant and respectful school culture, when that does not happen, the hostility gets worse. And what I have found, both at my own school and speaking with other educators, when you allow students to sit down and talk about stereotypes, prejudices, and biases in an atmosphere that is intentional and guided by an educator who has been given the tools to help students unpack this, the most amazing things happen.
Is this what you're talking about when you talk about dialogue techniques?
Yes. It's the ability to have students voice all those things that they hold in their minds, all those stereotypes and prejudices that when we list them on the board, I tell the students, okay, I want you to tell me what are some stereotypes that we have about people in our society. And at first, they're very hesitant to say it because they know this is not a very nice thing to say. But once they get them out there and the giggling and the, oh my gosh, I can't believe you said that, then we are allowed to talk about, okay, why did you say, I can't believe you said that? I was at a middle school yesterday doing a program, and one of the students said an insult that they hear in their school is, you're so gay. And all the middle schoolers were like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. I said, okay, why do we use that word? One of the students said, well, if you say that to a boy, it takes away their masculinity. And then a boy said, but if you say it, everybody around you knows you mean so much more than that. There's so many things in that word. So we talked about the power of one word to hurt not only the person you're directing the insult at, but you include a whole other group of people and you just tear them down. Middle schoolers understood that.
I was going to ask you how teachers combat the ubiquitous, pervasive media that drives a lot of this. And what I'm hearing you say is, yeah, you can guide the conversation, but the important thing is the conversation itself from peers.
Yes. And you give the students the permission. And yesterday when we were in the school, we laid out very carefully, we are saying these things in the context of this class because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about hurting other people with our words.
Where does this begin? Does this begin in first grade, second grade, fifth grade? Where do these hot button issues and the kind of speech that lead to hatred begin?
So it's funny, I was telling the middle schoolers I would never teach middle school because it is such a time of identity seeking and drama, and I just don't have the patience for that. I think it starts somewhere around 5th or 6th grade when the students start to get the intellectual capacity to understand there not only exists differences, but those differences can be used as weapons.
Yeah.
And it has to do with the development of the brain and the ability of the students to think concretely or,
Because the Anti-Defamation League, again, reports that anti-Semitic incidents in K through 12 schools increased 100% each year for the past 2 years. Are these incidents coming from kids who understand what they're saying or merely parroting something that they heard from somebody else or just finding a weapon, as you used it, as you said, that they need to use occasionally just because they feel insecure? What's going on here?
I think it can be all of the above. People can learn hate in their home. They can learn prejudicial views in their homes. Ibu Patel, a great thinker behind the Interfaith Youth Corps, he says that, like, if you look at faith, that's my area of expertise as a rabbi. He says faith can be a bubble of isolation, a barrier of division, a bomb of destruction, or a bridge of cooperation. And so I think children learn from their parents. And that's why this conversation needs to be not only about how we respond proactively in our middle schools and high schools and colleges, but as a society, how we teach parents and give communities those skills. And I think faith leaders and journalists, we all have a responsibility to go deeper, to find common ground, to explore issues underlying the speech that comes forth, to stop and say, what do we mean by the words that you just said? Can we unpack those? Can we learn about difference? Can we learn about different ways in which people look at the issue at hand?
The Davidsonian printed a guest column from one of your graduates recently, I think Vida Dadu, class of 18. She wrote, quote, "Reiterating the college's statement of purpose is not the panacea for hate speech on campus. Mission statements do little to denounce hate speech itself, and even less so to protect their students from it." Do students need to be protected from hate speech or educated to understand its underpinnings and confronted for what it is?
At that time, I think the call for protection was because students were feeling so insecure on campus that because we felt it was reasonable to fear some kind of violence might occur, and the students, even though they were not on campus, were not far from campus, there was a feeling at that time for protection. Can students be protected from hate speech, and should they be, becomes a lot more complicated. Something that our college president, Carol Quillen, talks about a lot and tries to bring into all of the work that she does on campus is this concept of brave inquiry. So being able to ask those questions that do make us feel a little bit uncomfortable and make us feel like maybe I shouldn't really be asking this question, but it's something that I need to know. And being able to embrace those kind of conversations, even though they may not immediately be politically correct, but there is an important lesson to be learned under there.
One of the problems here is that American politics has become the politics of demonization. It's much easier to demonize the other side than it is to put forth policies and plans that make sense or that advance the conversation. This is not the first time in history that this has happened, and it will not be the last, and particularly when it comes to anti-Semitism or the use of the N-word, this seems to come and go in lulls and surges. What have you learned? Because long before the N-word came into use, people were anti-Semitic. It's been going on for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. How do you explain the ebb and flow of this? It it goes away, it comes back. It goes away, it comes back.
And because of that ebb and flow, I think we need to be vigilant and we need to be responsive. My name is Judy Schindler, and I'm named for my grandfather's sister, Judy Schindler. She was murdered by the Nazis at the age of 32, alongside her 5 children, ages 10 to 2. Mm-hmm. So I know that the power of words can lead to demonization, dehumanization, and ultimately death. So I think we need to be very vigilant about the words we use and hold ourselves accountable and hold our communities accountable. In any act of oppression, there is the persecutor, and there's the victim, and there's the bystander and the upstander. And we need to give our students the tools simply to have the words to say to be that ally, to stand up. Are we running out of time here? Or we're okay. We really need to give our students and model what it means to stand up and say this is not okay, and to reach out and to build those bridges of connection.
If hate begets hate, Donna, is the reverse true? If you can educate people to see the other person as a human being, first of all, and secondly, to explore these issues, these hot-button words, and for what they really are, does that diffuse it? Does it end it? Does it build bridges?
Yes. When educators, when school systems have put these programs intentionally into place, there has been a decrease in hostility and animosity toward the other. You paint the other however you want to paint it.
Going back to an earlier comment, we have an emailer who said your guest criticized the media for not calling out the president for race baiting and hate speech. As a journalist, I beg to differ. The media have stepped up efforts to point this out and to correct falsehoods. I think a big part of the problem are our other leaders who haven't spoken out. That could be true, but if young people are not watching television or using radio as the point to get their news, there's very little we can do about it. We have to stop. Rabbi Judy Schindler, Donna Tarney from Queen's University of Charlotte, and Laura Dunnigan from Davidson College. Thank you all for the hour.
Charlotte Talks with Mike